So good morning. I think the start is 7:15. I don't want to hold people up. I'm impressed this many people came. So thank you. I was asked today to give a brief talk on medicinal cannabis. The title I chose was, Have We Put the Cart Before the Horse? You might get a sense of where I'm going to go with that. I was asked to put this code on the front screen so you could prove you were here. So if anybody needs to record it, there it is. I'm happy to take any questions during this that might arise or wait till the end, whatever people desire. Oh, sorry. There you go. Perfect. I do have some disclosures. I'm the Associate Director for the Michael G. DeGroote Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research. I have consulted to Health Canada for setting limits on amounts of cannabis permitted for personal medicinal use. I do hold a grant from CHR to study the effects on cannabis on chronic pain, but as of yet, I have no for-profit relationships to declare. The Michael G. DeGroote Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research, if you have heard of it, it is a virtual center. You can't find it on any map. But we took a picture outside the pain clinic, or maybe this is in the atrium, and these are some of the folks that I work with. So James McKillop up at West 5th, Ramesh Zacharias, who was the director of the chronic pain clinic, and myself. And we have sort of three general areas that we're trying to focus on. And we do have a website. We have an annual conference that comes up. So if you're interested in this topic, we do have some resources, and we do have some upcoming events that might be of interest. We're trying to curate evidence-based content. That includes both formal systematic reviews as well as research summaries of current topical papers that come out. We do have a Medicinal Cannabis Plus portal. So we contracted with the Health Research Information Unit, used to be run by Brian Haynes, now run by Alfonso Iorio, and basically they have a team. Any publications related to medicinal cannabis or cannabis gets appraised for quality and newsworthiness, and if it meets certain criteria, it automatically gets fed through to our portal. So if you're interested in the latest research, there's an opportunity to sign up for that. We are conducting what I'll call cutting-edge research. I hope it is. That includes some small randomized controlled trials, largely feasibility studies right now to put ourselves in a position to apply for larger grants, observational studies, cross-sectional studies, and we're looking at both the economics, policy, and also basic chemistry of medicinal cannabis. We have about 30 faculty members right now, and if people are interested in knowing more, perhaps even becoming affiliated, you can certainly email the center coordinator and get information on that. And we're quite interested on creating a network of individuals interested in this particular topic. We do have training programs where we provide funding for either research projects or graduate students or postdocs. And we do have an annual medicinal cannabis conference. So this year it's going to occur on March 1 and 2, and registrations will open up soon. It was very popular last year. We're hoping it's equally popular this year. So what's some of the background around medicinal cannabis? Well, prescription, and I shouldn't say prescription, unless you're dealing with a purified cannabinoid, you can't prescribe cannabis. It doesn't have a DIN. You can authorize it for use. But ever since 2001, authorization of medicinal cannabis has been legal for select conditions. So nausea and vomiting secondary to chemotherapy, weight loss secondary to treatment for HIV, some forms of chronic pain, typically neuropathic has been the one that's got the most attention. But it's been very, very selective and not sort of widely authorized, I would say. Recreational use has been illegal up until quite recently. And yet, in 2013, Canada had the unique distinction of being the leading per capita consumer of cannabis in the developed world. So, congratulations. To give you an idea, there was the Canadian Community Health Survey, which is run by Stats Canada. In 2012, they had a question on there asking about recent cannabis use. and about 12% of respondents indicated that they had used cannabis in the past year. Now, in 2014, there was further regulation put out there. There was the Marijuana for Medicinal Purposes regulation, and the government began maintaining a public database of licensed producers. Now, you can go out even in Hamilton and find dispensaries, speak to your local bud tender about what to get. They're not legal, however. It's only licensed producers that are allowed to actually provide cannabis. But there hasn't been a huge crackdown on some of the other distributors. And patients who receive authorization for use of medicinal cannabis from their physician must obtain formal proof that they have this, and they're tracked by Health Canada. So these are some of the numbers about registered medicinal cannabis users from when Health Canada started tracking. Started off at a modest 12,500. And as you can see, there appears to be a subtle trend that might escape you unless you're looking carefully. Current numbers that I've heard are closer to 350,000. So the increase has been substantial. One area where there's been a lot of attention has also been amongst Canadian veterans. So they currently authorize about 8,000 veterans to receive medicinal cannabis at a cost to taxpayers of somewhere between $40 and $60 million per year. So it is not trivial. As of October 17th of this year, it's legal for anybody to use for whatever purpose they deem necessary. And there's been some concerns around this policy. One of the concerns has been that once you legalize, it is going to lead to lots of people using. We did do some assessment of the literature on this, and what we found, at least from limited observational evidence, is that legalization or decriminalizing of cannabis does not appear to lead to a big bump in use. Now, there has been a couple of systematic reviews that have looked at this. Neither have found that there was this anticipated and feared uptick. We did find one primary study that noticed an initial uptick, primarily amongst adolescents, just after legalization, and then it kind of became something that wasn't a new exciting thing. Rates of use went down to what they were pre-legalization. Now, I don't know if that's going to play out in Canada, but one thing that we did is we've looked at the first 3 waves of something called the National Cannabis Survey. So this is something that Statistics Canada started running in 2018, and the first 3 waves all happened before October 2018, before legalization for recreational purposes. And one of the questions they had was, they said, after legalization, do you plan to increase or start using cannabis? And what we found was there was about 18.5% that said, yes, I will. And this is a nationally representative survey. And we combined data from 3 waves. They're all independent. Quite a few indicated interest in trying new products. A number said new sources. Now these are the maybes. These are the yeses. We don't know if intent is going to turn into actual behavior. And we also broke this down a little further because they had a question on the survey saying, have you used cannabis in the last 3 months? So we assumed if people said, yes, I have, then they're already using, and these are more the people that say they're going to increase their use. If they said, no, I have not, then we assume these were people that likely were not using cannabis. So when you break this 18.5% down, almost 16% of those were people that said, I do not use cannabis presently. So there was a lot of people on this question that appeared to be the potentially new users, right? So this is the kind of feared big bump that might happen. We're going to continue to follow this survey post-legalization and see if intent translates into behavior. But these are sort of early signals of what the implications of legalization might be.
Hi there, it's Eric from CSU. Do you mind just standing in front of the podium just so we get a better capture of the audio for the recording? If you want to point at anything, just use the mouse.
Oh, yes, I apologize. I didn't know I was being recorded.
No worries, that's my fault, sorry.
Oh, no, okay. Thank you for letting me know. Now, there is a lot of excitement around the potential of medicinal cannabis. This is a survey that came out in the Annals of Internal Medicine just last year, And again, this was a nationally representative sample of a little over 16,000 U.S. adults. And they asked them, what do you think about the risks and benefits of marijuana use? And what they found was 81% endorsed that cannabis has health benefits. They're convinced of that. 9% said it is completely risk-free. 22% believed it was impossible to become addicted to cannabis. Not so positive about the health benefits. It definitely does have risks, and you can get addicted to cannabis. So there seems to be a lot of enthusiasm that perhaps is getting ahead of the evidence in some cases. And you might wonder, well, where might this come from? If you do a Google search on medicinal cannabis, you come up with many fascinating websites. This is one I found. This handsome gentleman introduces himself as a psychiatrist who has recognized the incredible potential healing power of medicinal cannabis, and he has helpfully on his website developed a list of chronic conditions for which cannabis was shown to be helpful. Here is his list. So we have, of course, genital herpes and radiation therapy, post-polio syndrome, a number of things here, obesity, major depression, mania, writer's cramp, that's important, stuttering, I didn't know that, tension headache. This one has thoracic outlet syndrome and glaucoma, macular degeneration, gastritis, TMJ syndrome, prostatitis, eczema, arthritis, cervical disc disease. We're not done yet. Tenosynovitis, spina bifida, sleep apnea, insomnia, chronic fatigue syndrome, cough and hiccup, of course. Yes, got sleep apnea. Anyways, I ran out of room on the slide, but it's quite an extensive list. I didn't realize it had application for all of this. But there is a lot of information you can get out there on the web that will perhaps lead you to conclude that there's many more established roles for cannabis in a therapeutic role than perhaps the evidence is out there to support. The reality seems to be that the evidence for therapeutic application is limited. This was a recent editorial in the Journal of the American Medical Association, which basically said, we know it's legal in most states, but physicians have little evidence to guide them. A quote from someone that contributed to the article was, if you like having evidence on which to base your patient recommendations, for medicinal marijuana, it's really not available. So despite this widespread use, we really are maybe not quite sure what it can and what it can't do. And part of the issue around this is that cannabis has become more available for patients, not so much because the evidence has established a role, but through a series of legal challenges. Patients have said, you cannot deny my right to access this. And so now that it's out there, the evidence is kind of struggling to catch up. This was an interesting commentary written by a clinician at the Mayo Clinic titled, If Weed is Medicine, So is Budweiser. I guess the one quote that summarized up the article was, actual medicines have research behind them, enumerating their benefits, characterizing their harms, ensuring the former supersedes the latter. Marijuana doesn't. It's a toxin, not a medicine, impairs judgment, driving, increases the risk of psychosis and schizophrenia, and smoking it damages the respiratory tract. So they made the point in this article, yes, people with pain may feel better when they consume cannabis. They would also feel slightly better if they had a couple beers. It doesn't mean it has a therapeutic benefit. It might just be causing euphoria that distracts people from their condition. So there are very, very different perspectives out there, right? On one hand, you have clinicians such as the very friendly-looking Dr. Todd, who believes it has an enormous number of therapeutic benefits. On the other extreme, you have Dr. Bach here, who seems to have a very different opinion. So what are we talking about when we're discussing marijuana? Well, it's not a single agent, it's a plant. There's about 550 chemicals in total. About 100 are active. The two main ones that have been studied that you've probably heard of are THC and CBD. And where does it work? Well, it works primarily through two receptors that have been well characterized. CB2 is one. CB1 is the other, and what you can see is that they tend to be fairly widespread throughout our system. So it's unlikely that cannabis is going to have a very selective targeted effect. And the reason for that is that we have an endocannabinoid system. So we make chemicals that look very much like the individual cannabinoids in marijuana that bind to receptors that we already typically use for other processes. So the endocannabinoid system is involved in things such as central nervous system development, synaptic plasticity, respond to endogenous and environmental insults, homeostasis. It's involved in moderating a lot of things that we do all the time. So taking on board an exogenous source has implications that might be helpful, but it might have implications that are not so helpful as well. When you look at THC, we know that it's associated with dependence. You can become physically dependent on THC. It tends to be in very large proportions in cannabis that is designed for recreational purposes. And if you look at seizure studies in the US primarily, about 20 years ago when they were pulling cannabis from seizures off the street, it had about 4% THC. They do the same thing these days, is up around 12, 13, even 15%. So today's cannabis is not your grandparents' cannabis. It is associated with cannabis use disorder, otherwise known as addiction. About 2% yearly incidence and 7% lifetime prevalence for habitual users. And the other, this is the pictogram of a CB1 receptor. And again, the anandamide is the cannabinoid-like component that we make endogenously, and then THC looks similar enough that it can bind to this receptor. It's a partial agonist, acts at the CB1 receptors. It's highly lipophilic, so it has a very long half-life. Means it sticks around in your system quite a long time. Deposits in the adipose tissue, is re-released into blood. Recurrent use can even lead to accumulation. These are the metabolites that a number of the testing kits will sort of pick up, but complete elimination may take up to a month. So this is why a lot of the law enforcement officers are struggling to figure out what they're going to do for a roadside test. This is why the Toronto Police Force said, don't use cannabis within a month of coming to work because we don't want to be able to detect it in you. So it's proving to be a little bit problematic in terms of understanding when is someone under the influence of cannabis and when is someone simply still releasing these metabolites because of its properties. And again, the other major component, cannabidiol, CBD, similar in structure to THC, but very minimal psychoactivity. The World Health Organization put out a position paper last year saying CBD is not addictive, you cannot develop dependence, it is essentially inert regarding psychoactivity. Primary effects may include pain relief, reduction in nausea, vomiting, could be an anti-anxiety agent, some limited evidence to suggest it's possible, seems to have some anti-inflammatory properties, may help reduce certain forms of seizures. And this last area was quite interesting because there has now been a couple of quite reasonable randomized controlled trials published in the New England Journal of Medicine showing that children with treatment-resistant seizure disorders, different forms of epilepsy, do show a statistically significant improvement in their seizure intensity and frequency when they were given concentrated cannabidiol, CBD, versus placebo. So what they've done is they've taken this very nebulous plant and they've pulled out the one little component, they've tested it formally. This now does have a DIN. So the FDA approved Epidiolex last year, and it's not a first-line therapy for forms of epilepsy, but it's now available, right? And this kind of thing happens all the time. You don't go and tell patients to start eating foxglove. It's tremendously poison, but you may prescribe digitalis, which was derived from that plant as well. So this is one way that cannabis might be approached, by teasing out individual cannabinoids, formally testing, and seeing if there might be a role for it to play in certain conditions. Now, one of the challenges is, whereas there might be benefits for some conditions, there also appears to be the association of harms, and one is the potential for an increased risk of psychosis. So there's been at least one systematic review that has reported this positive association between cannabis use and early onset psychosis. the association is stronger amongst younger consumers, and it does not seem to suggest at this point a cause effect, but more those individuals that are already predisposed towards developing psychosis. Use of cannabis may trigger this earlier onset of their first episode. And there's also the potential for a similar association with depression. Now, also interesting is there's been observational studies primarily looking at jurisdictions in the U.S., different states that have either legalized or decriminalized cannabis, and they've noticed this reduction in rates of suicide. They don't know why, but this was quite interesting, and this has now been formally reported in the literature a couple of times. And one primary study found that the greatest reduction was typically amongst men aged 20 through 39. And people have sort of wondered, might there be something, for example, in helping to mitigate symptoms associated with post-traumatic stress disorder? Certainly that's one of the reasons that the Canadian veterans are currently getting authorized for cannabis a lot. There has been this recent review published in the Annals, and again, there's just so little evidence out there that they said it's insufficient for us to draw any conclusions as to whether use of cannabis might help or hinder treatment of PTSD. But one reason that there continues to be this interest in looking at possible therapeutic benefits is they look at states in the U.S. where they've either legalized or decriminalized cannabis, and after they do so, rates of certain prescription medications go down. People aren't getting certain prescriptions filled as much, and this includes medications for anxiety, depression, nausea, pain, sleep disorders, and muscle spasticities. And it at least suggests the possibility that some patients may be substituting cannabis when it becomes more available for conditions that they were otherwise managing through prescription medication. So there might be a role. But again, this is early days, observational data. We don't know if there's anything promising enough here to dictate a formal therapeutic application, but these are interesting trends. There's something else that's been happening lately, which you might be unaware of, but there's been some attention on opioids lately. You might have missed it. And there's been increasing pressure on reducing the amount of opioid prescribing, particularly for conditions such as chronic non-cancer pain. And as cannabis seems to be getting more popular, people have suggested that there might be this pressure to switch from one to the other. So this was a recent editorial published in JAMA called Opioids Out, Cannabis In, basically concluding that the mandated transition to limit use of opioids paired with the current climate around liberalizing cannabis may lead to patients' formal and informal substitution. So this is an area that is of interest to try to explore a bit more. Certainly when we've surveyed patients attending the chronic pain clinic here at McMaster, it is not completely uncommon to hear about patients that are using cannabis, at least in some cases. But the question is, does it work? Another interesting trend that has been noted is that cannabis legalization appears to be associated with a reduction in opioid-related mortality. One study found a 25% lower mean annual rate of mortality from opioid overdoses in states that have legalized compared to those where it remained illegal. And again, this effect seemed to get larger over time. This study was reported in JAMA Internal Medicine in 2014, but there's been other studies that have shown this sort of similar effect. And so again, if people are substituting use of their opioids, whether it's for therapeutic or recreational purposes, and going to cannabis, you are going to be at a lower risk of overdosing from opioids. There are a lot of adverse events associated with regular cannabis use, but you cannot fatally overdose. You can become terribly hungry, nausea, you can become psychotic, you can become paranoid and have delusions. You will not fatally overdose. So again, interesting trends. So what about the actual evidence out there for using medicinal cannabis as a strategy to manage chronic non-cancer pain? There's been a couple reviews out there. We think we can do one better, so we're undertaking that process. And we're looking at randomized controlled trials that have looked at cannabis versus any comparator for the treatment of chronic non-cancer pain. And we want studies that have enrolled at least 10 patients and that follow patients for at least 2 weeks. We don't want these studies that look 2 hours after a dose to see what happens. We have so far, this is an earlier version of the review. We've just updated it. So this version found 26 eligible trials. We recently updated our search. We now have around 36. So we're going to hopefully get that submitted this year. But based on that original 26 articles, here's some of what we found. So this is a forest plot, and basically this line up the middle here is the line of no effect. This is medicinal cannabis versus placebo. These dots are the average effect on pain relief reported in each individual trial. The line through the dot is the measure of precision, and anything to this side of the line indicates pain reduction favoring cannabis over placebo. And what you can see looking at this is we've got a large number of very imprecise studies. The trend seems to suggest benefit, and when we pool everything together, we get a nice, tight average. And we see that with these 20 studies that have about 1,800 patients, with a follow-up ranging anywhere from 14 to 98 days, medicinal cannabis versus placebo results in a small but important improvement in pain. Moderate quality evidence. And when I say small, what we did is we converted all the pain scales in these trials to a 10 centimeter visual analog scale for pain. Use of cannabis results in, on average, a 0.55 centimeter reduction. And I would suggest that that information is completely unhelpful to anybody. So what you need to know is, well, so what? It's statistically significant. Is it clinically relevant? Well, what if I told you that the minimally important difference for this scale is about 1 centimeter? No one's going to argue it's smaller than that. Well, you might say, wait a second, Jason, 0.55 is less than 1 centimeter. If the average effect is less than the MID, looks like it's statistically significant but clinically irrelevant. The problem with that is it assumes that every single patient out there gets the same analgesic response and that there is no distribution about that mean. And we know both those things are likely to be false. So we took it a step further and we said, wait a second, let's model the proportion of patients that are likely to achieve the minimally important difference. And when we do that, we find that although the average effect is quite modest, that the risk difference for achieving the MID is about 12% versus taking placebo. So that translates to a number needed to treat of about 8. Got to treat about 8 patients with chronic pain versus placebo to get one that will say, I feel better to the point that I'm noticing it. So modest effect, but might be an option for some that haven't found relief with other agents, and chronic non-cancer pain is often very challenging to find anything for. What about direct evidence, right? We've seen all this hype around substituting cannabis for opioids. We did recently publish a large systematic review looking at opioids for chronic non-cancer pain. We looked at any comparators out there. Unfortunately, about 85% of the existing trials compared to a placebo, not the comparison we'd like to see, but we did find one trial reported in the British Medical Journal, small crossover study. Now, the trial itself reported that opioids were more effective than nabilone, which is a synthetic THC. But when we looked at the study and we actually reanalyzed their data, we found no difference in the effect. When we contacted the author, they said, sorry, the person that did the analysis is retired. I don't know what to tell you. So we ended up concluding in our review that there appeared to be low quality evidence from this one study that synthetic THC produced similar benefits to pain and function compared to opioids. So again, is this conclusive? No. But it at least shows some potential. What about adverse events? Well, out of the studies that we found, these were the ones that were reported by at least 10 trials. And again, probably no surprise here. This is sort of the list that is commonly associated with use of cannabis. We did pool a few of these so far. This is the effect on drowsiness. And again, you know, one person's side effect might be another person's therapy, right? If I'm struggling with a sleep disorder, maybe I want to be drowsy. But this is chronic pain patients. And so again, what we found was moderate quality evidence that medicinal cannabis did result in an increase in drowsiness. Again, about 13% more patients reported this versus those randomized to placebo. Dizziness or vertigo, we see a similar significant association, but a fair bit larger. This time it was about double the risk. 26% more patients reported dizziness or vertigo. And again, when you hear about these associations with drowsiness, dizziness, vertigo, it's perhaps no surprise that people are worried about driving if people are using medicinal cannabis or doing other activities where you need to be alert. There has recently been published in the Canadian Family Physician Journal what they call a simplified guideline for prescribing medicinal cannabis. But I would maintain that this is not so much of a guideline as it is a position paper. So there was not a formal systematic review of the literature. They didn't consider patient values and preferences. This is sort of a group of clinicians that have some expertise in this area coming together to say, this is what we think is reasonable. And again, they really say if other things haven't worked, then you could talk about this with your patient. They do talk about going towards a synthetic before you go to something else, but in reality, there's no clear evidence to suggest going with a synthetic cannabinoid prior to initiating medicinal cannabis. Nabilone, the approval was for chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting, so it's got off-label use for pain. Sativex is pretty pricey, and there's not really much coverage for it. So I don't know how passionately you'd have to follow this. This is more general guidance based on a consensus. Again, I wouldn't call it a formal guideline. When I talk about this idea about patient values and preferences, you know, I'm not saying anything new in this room, but evidence alone is insufficient for clinical decisions, right? Especially when we're looking at an agent such as cannabis, which for chronic pain is likely to have very modest benefit. It also is going to have some adverse events. It's not going to be a clear-cut decision. It's going to be a matter of providing information to patients and saying, this is what we know about benefit, this is what we know about harm. How can we work to help you make a decision consistent with your values and preferences? So going back to the world of opioids briefly, when we did the guideline for this, we conducted a formal systematic review on values and preferences. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but just to sort of highlight what we found, because it might be relevant to cannabis. And it was surprising to us, but we found patients living with unrelenting chronic pain, surprise, surprise, they placed a very high value on small but important pain relief. And they were willing to trade rare but serious harms. Now, these attitudes seem to change. In the focus groups we did, we had a patient panel of about 16 individuals with chronic pain, and I remember when I was going through the sort of risks of, you know, overdose or death, addiction, there wasn't a lot of concern I was hearing, except one lady on the group, and turns out that she had been using fentanyl patches, and she lived out in the peg, and she got up one cold morning and put her patch on her hip and got in her heated car seat and started driving to work and woke up in the ditch. Right, because the heating from the car seats increased the absorption. She overdosed. She was very concerned about avoiding future overdoses because she'd experienced one. So at least some of our work suggested that those patients that had experienced a rare but adverse event were much more concerned about avoiding them. So that experience then allowed their values and preferences to dovetail more with society's. But this was sort of the general gestalt from a lot of the chronic pain patients. I'm worried about my pain. I'm not so worried about things that might happen. Quite a bit less value on avoiding addiction or physical dependence. High concern regarding effects associated with dose reduction or cessation of opioid use. And so when we were working on making our recommendations, yes, we had the evidence around opioids for chronic pain, but we also took these values and preferences into consideration. So we placed a high value, again, this is for opioids for chronic pain, on societal considerations of minimizing risk of rare but serious adverse events. And because we heard so many stories about people concerned about withdrawal, we placed a high value on avoiding suffering associated with that. So again, I don't know what we'd find if we did this with a group of patients concerning medicinal cannabis for chronic pain, but things like this might emerge, and that's the role they would play in a guideline. If you decide you're working with a patient, other things haven't worked, you decide maybe I want to explore medicinal cannabis, it's still not that straightforward. You have a range of products to consider that are out there. You have your oral products, which are typically cannabis or cannabinoids that are suspended in oil. And you can find products that are very high THC, very high CBD, or a blend between the both. If you go to inhaled products, whether smoked or vaporized, you're sort of dealing with the same thing. So cannabis is not cannabis is not cannabis. There is some work that has to be done to try to understand what type of cannabis you think the patient in front of you might want to start exploring with. Again, a number of the clinicians that I've spoken to tend to favor embarking more on products that are ingested as opposed to inhaled. They tend to want to explore products that are high in CBD and very low in THC, and if they don't get a good response, maybe to drift more towards a blended type of offering. And again, this is just to avoid the adverse events, which are largely associated with the THC component of cannabis. I put on the bar graph our sort of analysis of the National Cannabis Survey that indicate individuals after cannabis gets legal become more interested in experimenting with other forms of consumption, things like edibles, for example. And this becomes an issue because of the way that you begin to feel the effects. And so specifically when smoking, peak blood levels of THC, for example, the euphoric component, occurs within a matter of minutes. But if you ingest it through some form of edible, it can take hours, and it can last longer as well. So it's important, especially for those people that might have experience with smoking cannabis, for them to understand there is a very different reaction they're going to undergo if they move to an edible. Right now in Canada, we do not have edibles that are legal for recreational purposes, but that's coming in October 2019. And I know the government is very eager to put out a lot of education around this. Just to give you an idea about what it looks like visually, this is the differences in onset and duration between inhaled versus ingested cannabis. Again, inhaled, quick reaction, big spike in the blood, but it also tends to fade fairly quickly. Whereas when it's ingested, you do not get the same sort of high levels of THC, for example, but it persists for quite a few hours. This can have consequences, and here is an example of one of them. I'd mentioned before that we have all these dispensaries out there. They're not legal, and so every now and then the police decide to bust one. So this was an example about some Toronto officers that busted one of these dispensaries. And as they're walking out, one of them said, "Those chocolate bars look interesting. I think I'll take some." Went out to his squad car with his buddy. I guess they maybe had some experience with smoking cannabis. And they said, "Let's try this." They ate a bit. "I don't feel anything. Let's keep going." 8 more, 8 more, 8 more. An hour later, they both went into overdose, essentially. So intense paranoia, delusions, all the rest. Called back to their squad in a panic. "Send everybody, we've just overdosed." As you can see, the judge that ended up overseeing this case was not particularly sympathetic, and this individual ended up resigning. But it does, it's a humorous story, but it sort of highlights a real issue between mode of consumption, right? So summary of the results to date. What have we learned from what we've looked at? And again, it's early days. There's a lot that we don't know versus what we do, but there appears to be at least moderate quality evidence showing that cannabis provides a modest relief from chronic pain versus placebo. We don't have a lot of trials that have compared it to other active agents. In the one we know of versus opioids, looks like it is equivalent, but again, it's a low-quality small study. We have low-quality evidence, again, that nabilone, which is a synthetic THC, may provide similar improvement, pain and function versus opioids, but that's from one study. Moderate quality evidence that it is associated with an increased risk of drowsiness and dizziness. And the results are limited by short follow-up times. Again, when you're dealing with chronic non-cancer pain, this is not a condition that gets cured. People end up being on treatment for years. It's unfortunate that the studies we have in this area only follow people for weeks or, in rare cases, a few months. We really would like longer-term studies. And the limitations of the evidence suggest that new data, new results may alter these conclusions. So that's currently where we're at. I wish I could give you more concrete information, but we're certainly working hard to try to get it. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them. Yes?
Jason, thank you very much. It was very interesting and comprehensive. I thought, because I'm an old fart, that if you took cannabis, then you would tend to want to take narcotics after that to get more of an effect and more of a euphoria. Is there any evidence that that's the case? Because you tend to say the opposite. People who were taking narcotics now feel more comfortable taking cannabis, which is kind of useful.
Yeah, there does appear to be a substitution going in the opposite direction that you would fear. There also appears to be a substitution effect for alcohol. So you do see in places where cannabis is more available, rates of binge drinking or admissions for alcohol-related complaints tend to go down. Rates of motor vehicle accidents secondary to alcohol tend to go down. And they saw this in Colorado and in Washington State. So it is interesting to try to understand exactly what's going on. On the other hand, it's been very difficult to understand the risks associated with smoked cannabis because people that consume cannabis regularly also tend to be smokers of tobacco. And so there it's very difficult to disentangle the two. There may be cases in some individuals where it does act somewhat as a gateway drug, but at least the observational evidence that we've looked at, and we have a large review that we're undertaking looking at the impact of legalization, decriminalization. We found about 100 observational studies. Again, it's something else we hope to get out this year. But what we've looked at thus far would suggest the opposite. It appears as if, in at least some cases, people are moving away from competing alternatives instead of stacking them on top of the cannabis. Yes?
Thanks for the presentation.
Sure.
I had a question for prescribed cannabis for pediatric use.
Oh.
I'm only asking because last week I actually had a patient whose mom came to my pain clinic and said that a family physician had prescribed vaped THC-containing cannabis for the 16-year-old.
Wow.
With the prescription saying vape every 3 hours.
Wow.
And now he hasn't gone to school in a year because he can't vape at school. So is this legal? Is this ethical? And what do I say to this family? You know?
That strikes me as problematic.
This is a pain clinic in Burlington.
Yeah.
What do we do about this?
So the medical associations have really been sort of, to some degree, caught flat-footed by this whole thing. And you've had representatives from the Canadian Medical Association coming out saying, after legalization for recreational purposes, we're out of the medicinal cannabis business. Forget it. We're out of it. On the other hand, I'll tell you, we were approached by representatives of the OMA, and they said, it is the leading issue that our members want to know about. Please prepare educational modules so that they can look at them for CME credits. And we recently were involved in doing that. So it's a real Wild West out there. And as you saw from the wonderful website example I put up of our friendly Dr. Todd, there are practitioners out there that are wildly enthusiastic about use for an incredible range of complaints. And there are those that think this is not a therapeutic agent. And there's a lot of people just sitting in the middle saying, I'm going to wait for more evidence to make my mind up. My sense is if you see someone prescribing vape THC to 16-year-olds, that might be worth raising an alarm about. That doesn't really strike me as something where we have evidence to suggest the benefits are going to exceed the harms. And certainly if you say they haven't been at school for a year, it seems as if that's not best practice. I would be concerned about that, which I think you are.
But the parents say the
I know. I mean, one thing you'll find a lot too is there's an incredible proliferation of Skype doctors right now. So you'll go to one of these clinics and you say, I think I might need medicinal cannabis, and they sit you down in front of a laptop and they Skype you to someone, you know, in another part of the world, and they ask you 4 questions, hit print, and a certificate comes out authorizing. So I think that there's very loose regulations at present around the authorization process. I think you're going to see it get tightened up, but I would think that the college would benefit from hearing these kinds of stories, just to understand the challenges that are out there. I hope these stories are very much the exception as opposed to the rule, but I do think that it deserves some attention so that, you know, these things don't become more widespread.
It's pretty fun.
Really?
I
Wow.
remember a 6-year-old in St. Catharines, a dispenser gave cannabis oil to a 6-year-old, was mailed to them in a bottle.
Yeah.
Tracking.
I saw a story recently about a clinician that did get sanctioned or in some way disciplined for prescribing to minors. You know, again, there have been these 2 studies out in the New England Journal looking at pediatric seizure disorders, pure CBD. That's different than vaping THC. So, you know, in limited cases, there might be some evidence for certain select disorders, but, you know, the kind of thing that you seem to be describing suggests practice that is far ahead of any evidence that we have, and the evidence that we do have, especially amongst the use of, you know, higher risk events in terms of, you know, neurologic development in minors, really suggests that that's not a great idea. There's a reason that the Canadian government has said, you know, in Ontario, I think you got to be at least 19 to access cannabis for recreational use, because of the evidence we have from observational studies about the neurodevelopmental effects of cannabis, the potential effects, right? These are associations. The Canadian Psychiatric Association last year put out a position paper saying, we would like the limit to be at age 21. You know, we don't even want it to be less than that. So I can't imagine anybody who's looked at the evidence out there suggesting that 6 or 16 is an age that you want to start subjecting, you know, regular doses of THC for, you know, pain, for example. I really can't see that being very defensible with what we know at present. So I would track it. You may want to write it up to raise attention, but it certainly seems problematic. All right. Well, thank you, and you're out 10 minutes early.